thing when we talk of organisms is the concept of a food chain. And I'm sure you're all familiar with food chain. You know, we often talk about food chain. For example, we say Central Texas has the entire academic food chain. What does that mean? Well, there are school districts, and then there are community colleges, and then there are four-year institutions, and then there are huge internationally renowned research institutions like UT Austin. So it's a food chain. You know, students move from one to another to another. Likewise, I'm sure you're familiar with the savanna in Africa, right? You have the herbivore, you have basically vegetation, and then you have herbivores like zebra and gazelle and deer and so forth. Then you have the carnivores. So that constitutes a food chain. So all organisms have to consume resources in order to stay alive and go about their daily life. And the transference of these resources from one organism to the next constitutes what we call a food chain. So from grass to zebra to lion, right? So that's the food chain, and there is a transference of resource. One feeds on the other. And these resources include stuff like nutrients and the energy that's embodied in the nutrient, right? Nutrients can release energy. And so each of these stages is basically called a trophic level. So each of these stages in the food chain is called a trophic level. And traditionally, we identify 4 kinds of trophic levels. We have, at the very beginning, we have what are called extractors. So these are things that take stuff from nature and convert it into a form that the next level, which are called producers, can use. The producers, in turn, create a product that consumers can use. And there could be various levels of consumers. Finally, when all is said and done, you have decomposers that try to salvage things. So these are different trophic levels. So what we will do is we will look at a biological food chain. Let's say this is from the ocean, and here is a biological food chain. So in the beginning, we have these things called extractors. They're basically bacteria in the ocean. So bacteria take materials, minerals in the ocean, and they convert it into mineral salts. Because mineral salts are what plant forms use. Here we're talking about a very basic plant form called planktons. So the plankton relies on the mineral salt. It also uses sunlight or energy, and so it takes energy and mineral salts and produce vegetative matter, basically sea plant form. We have multiple layers of consumers. So this is your extractor, this is your primary producer. The first consumer are basically invertebrate creatures in the ocean. Maybe shrimps belong to that family, those that don't have a backbone, right? So they may feed on vegetative matter, and as a result of metabolism, they produce egesta, which is basically waste from metabolism, and they in turn are eaten by secondary consumer, which are small fish. And when small fish feed, they produce also egesta, but they also produce carcass, which means some form of the shrimp or other that they eat, and some are discarded. So those are outputs, and then the fish are fed by what we call the third level consumer, tertiary, which are larger fish, right? The same thing you see here. There are waste in the form of egesta and carcass, and then you have the topmost in the food chain, right? Like the lion in the savanna, you have the sharks which feed on large fish, and so when the sharks feed, again you have egesta and you have carcass, and so all of this egesta from various consumer levels, all of the carcass from various levels go to what is called a decomposer. Those are another group of bacteria which feed on the refuse and tries to separate it into useful and not so useful stuff. A small amount of not so useful stuff is lost, but a lot of the egesta and carcass are recovered as inorganic materials, and they're passed back to the plankton. So there's a lot of recycling. So if you see this thing, it goes around, and very little is wasted. That's the only thing you see wasted here. So this is a food chain with the different trophic levels. So the question is, what does industrial food chain look like? And so for this, we have a manufacturing example from the manufacture of computers. Essentially, we're talking about cables, copper-based cables, right? So the first level is extractor. That is what the bacteria used to do earlier, right? So the extractor is basically your miner or mines, where from earth, so the process always begins from nature. Earth is either land or ocean. So copper ore is mined, and it's in the mine it's purified, and ore concentrate, because the dirt is separated, so it's more concentrated. It goes to a smelter, which is called a primary producer. The smelter uses the refined copper ore and energy in the form of electrical energy. Melting takes place, and big blocks of copper called copper ingots are produced. It goes to the next level, which is a first stage of consumer. So the first stage of consumer takes the ingot and converts it into a wire, right? From block of copper to a fine wire. So it goes through a process called rolling, or in rolling mills. You need lots of energy. Then the copper wire goes to a secondary consumer, which is a cable manufacturer. So the cable manufacturer embeds the copper coil or wire in a plastic sheet and so forth. Then goes on to a computer manufacturer who uses these cables in the computer. And finally, the topmost level in the food chain, usually that means you and I, whether it's automotive or electronic, we are the topmost consumer, right? So we, the public, the consumer, uses the computer. There's a finite lifetime, then it becomes obsolete. We get rid of the computer. Now, during all of this processing, although not shown here, there will be a lot of waste. During manufacturing, there are a lot of waste effluents in the form of liquids, gases that are released, solid materials, etc. And so waste are there. It's only shown here, but over all of here, there will be waste, right? So ultimately, after whatever, 2 years, 5 years, the computer then is discarded. It typically goes to a disassembler, what do you call them, auto junkyard, where they take an automobile and try to recover whatever you can, maybe a stereo system and other things, and then the metal is scrapped and sent elsewhere. So they try to recover like the power supply or things that are still good, and then they are sold back sometimes to the consumer because they just need a power supply. I have been there in one of our labs. In a single month, we lost power supplies on 3 or 4 computers, so we had to buy spares, and it helps to buy used spares because they're not very expensive. Some material that's recovered from, like the copper, will go back to the cable manufacturer, and then some of the computer bulk, the outer cover and so forth, goes to the recycler. The recycler may send it back to the primary producer, but there will be some material lost. The key thing is there will be losses at various points here. In a biological system, the shrimp is eaten by the small fish by the big fish, and the big fish by the shark. There is very little that's really wasted. Even waste for one becomes input for the other. That's not true with industrial systems.